I never imagined that the deepest battle of my life would not be fought in uniform or under a foreign sky, but beneath the chandeliers of my childhood home. For years, I had carried the weight of silence, the sting of my father's disapproval, the ache of never being enough for the world he built on oil and money. I thought I had left all that behind when I traded silk dresses for combat boots. But the truth has a way of waiting for you. And mine came roaring back the night of his grand birthday gala, when he stood before a room full of veterans and called my medals nothing more than scraps of metal. Before we dive into this story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if stories of courage and resilience speak to you. And share in the comments where you are listening from and what hour it is in your corner of the world. It is always moving to see how far these stories travel and whose hearts they reach. That night, I sat at a table lined with generals, widows, and young cadets chasing a dream of service, and I realized that family could betray you more sharply than any enemy ever could. My father had used his fortune to build foundations and scholarships for veterans, not out of love but for spectacle. And in that moment of humiliation, when he sought to diminish me, it was not my voice that rose in defense. It was theirs. The men and women who had carried scars and buried friends stood for me. Their truth filled the room and changed everything. This is not just a story about revenge. It is a story about honor, about the family we choose, and the courage it takes to stand in silence while others speak the truth for you. I was born into marble and glass, but I never once felt at home inside it. The Hallbrook estate rose above the city like a monument to oil and steel, every window polished until it reflected the world back in sharp fragments. To outsiders, we were the picture of success. People drove past our gates and whispered that my father, Richard Hallbrook, was a self-made titan. He had built an empire in the oil fields of Texas and turned it into a financial powerhouse that stretched far beyond pipelines and rigs. He wore his power like a second skin, tailored in Italian suits, and carried himself as though the world existed to applaud him. Inside those walls, the air was colder than the stone floors. Love was measured not in warmth but in performance. My three brothers were raised as heirs, each groomed for a different corner of the empire. From the moment they could hold a pen, they were fed balance sheets and investment reports. My father would rest his heavy hand on their shoulders and say they were the future. I was given pearls and told to keep my chin up. My future, according to him, depended not on what I achieved but on whom I married. He never said it outright, but the message was carved deep into every dinner conversation, every lecture delivered across the mahogany table. He would look at me and say things like a daughter's worth is in how well she reflects her family. My brothers were taught to rule. I was taught to smile. There was no space for my questions about history, no patience for my fascination with the stories of soldiers and sailors who had stood their ground when no one believed in them. To my father, those were tales for the poor, for men without futures. He built empires. Soldiers only followed orders. Yet, even as a child, I felt the tug of something greater than oil profits or social alliances. While my brothers practiced golf swings at the country club, I would sneak into the library and press my fingers against the spines of military biographies. I read about Normandy, about women who served as nurses in tents where the air reeked of antiseptic and gunpowder. I read about pilots who flew despite the world telling them they could not. At night, under the covers, I held a flashlight and whispered the words of mottos I barely understood, but somehow already believed in. My father noticed once. He caught me in his study, running my fingers over an old medal he had kept locked away in a drawer. It had belonged to my grandfather, a man who fought in Korea before oil rigs replaced duty in the family narrative. My father laughed, the kind of laugh that cuts instead of comforts. "Do not waste your time on that junk," he said, snatching it from me. "Soldiers take orders, CEOs give them." That was the philosophy he lived by, the creed he tried to brand into us. My brothers absorbed it. I refused. I was the misfit in a house that demanded conformity. At school, while my classmates lined up Ivy League applications, I joined rock. While my brothers wore pressed blazers and recited market predictions, I tied my boots tighter and ran drills at dawn. My father called it rebellion. I called it survival. Because every time he dismissed me, every time he told me I was embarrassing the family name, I felt the fire inside me grow hotter. The conflict reached its boiling point the year I turned 18. My father had mapped out my future as though it were one of his business strategies. There would be a debutante ball, a prestigious college where the right kind of young men studied, followed by a carefully arranged marriage that would strengthen alliances in oil, politics, or finance. My role was not to lead, but to stand beautifully beside power. I remember the night I told him I had applied to the Naval Academy. We were seated at the long oak table, silver gleaming under the chandelier, my mother silent at the far end. My brothers smirked into their plates, enjoying that it was not their turn under his fire. My heart pounded so loud I thought the crystal glasses would shatter from the sound. I said, "Father, I have decided to serve. I have applied to Annapolis." The room froze. He set down his fork with a deliberate clink against the china. For a long moment, he just looked at me, his expression unreadable, like a man staring at an unfamiliar language. Then his lips curled into a smile that was more sneer than joy. "The Holbrook family builds legacies," he said. "We do not crawl in the mud. You will withdraw the application tomorrow." I shook my head. "I am not withdrawing." The silence that followed felt like a storm gathering. His face darkened and he leaned forward, his voice low but seething. "Holbrooks need leaders, not soldiers. You think medals will matter. They are just bits of metal. What matters is control, money, influence. I built all of this so my children would never have to salute anyone." I felt my hands tremble under the table, but my voice came out steady. "Maybe I do not want your kind of power." His hands slammed down on the table, rattling the silverware. My brothers flinched. My mother closed her eyes as though she had heard it all before. He leaned back, shook his head, and said words that would echo in me for years. "If you walk down that path, do not expect me to walk beside you." I carried those words like a scar into the years that followed. They were chains at first, but eventually they became fuel. The night I received my acceptance letter, I held it in my hands like proof that I had been right to believe in myself. My father did not congratulate me. He did not even look at the letter. He poured himself a drink and left the room. For 2 months, he did not speak to me at all, but I had already chosen. I packed my bags, kissed my mother on the cheek, and stepped out of the house that had never felt like home. The gates closed behind me, and for the first time, I breathed air that was not weighted with his expectations. I did not know then what the years ahead would demand of me, or how deeply those early battles with my father would shape the woman I became. All I knew was that I had finally taken my first step away from the marble halls of the Holbrook Empire and toward a life of my own making. And in that choice, I felt something my father had never given me: freedom. The drive away from the Holbrook estate that summer felt longer than it should have. The car windows reflected the fading light of a Texas evening, and for once I did not glance back at the mansion perched on the hill. I had always thought of that house as something unmovable, carved into the skyline like a fortress. But as the gates closed behind me, it felt smaller, almost fragile. Maybe it was because I finally realized I did not need it to survive. Still, a part of me carried the weight of what I was leaving behind. My mother had slipped a folded note into my bag that morning, her eyes soft with the sadness she never spoke aloud. "Be brave, be true to yourself." Her handwriting was slanted, the ink pressed hard into the paper as if she had poured all her unspoken strength into those words. I tucked it into the side pocket of my duffel, where I knew it would travel with me long after her voice faded. The academy did not wait for anyone, least of all daughters of wealthy men who thought they were above sweat and discipline. From the moment I stepped onto those grounds, the air changed. It smelled of salt and steel, the Chesapeake wind cutting sharper than any reprimand my father had ever delivered. The first morning began before the sun, boots pounding pavement in a rhythm that left no space for hesitation. For the first time in my life, I was not the daughter of Richard Holbrook. I was just another plebe stripped of privilege, tested in every way that mattered. The days blurred into weeks. My body ached in places I never knew could ache. My lungs burned with every mile, my arms trembled with every push-up. There were nights I collapsed into the bunk with sweat still drying on my skin, wondering if my father had been right, if maybe I was not strong enough. But then I would hear the quiet rustle of others around me. Men and women just as exhausted, just as stubborn. And I realized we were all carrying something heavy into that place. Mine was the weight of a father's scorn. Theirs was poverty, broken families, or the ghosts of siblings lost to war. We carried it together, and somewhere in that carrying I found belonging. One memory stays sharp. It was a drill in the pouring rain, mud clinging to every inch of my uniform. An upperclassman barked orders inches from my face, his voice hoarse with authority. "You think you belong here, Hallbrook. Your father's money cannot save you. Prove it." My knees shook, but I held his stare, the rain stinging like needles. I had no words, only grit. I finished the course with mud in my hair and blood on my palms. That night, when I peeled off my wet clothes and saw the bruises, I felt something I had never felt in that mansion on the hill. Pride. My father had once told me medals were nothing more than cheap metal. He was wrong. Every scrape, every ribbon, every hard-earned recognition carried a story no ledger could contain. They were not adornments, they were proof that I had chosen a harder path and survived it. The letters from home were scarce. My mother wrote often, her words a balm against the silence of my father. She told me she admired my strength, even if she did not always understand it. She told me she kept my room the same, though I knew I would never truly return to it. My brothers wrote only once, a brief postcard signed with their names as though it were a chore to complete. And my father, nothing, not a word. The silence became its own kind of message. Yet even in that silence, he was always with me. Every time I laced my boots, I heard his voice mocking. Every time I ran until my lungs threatened to give out, I imagined his smirk, and instead of breaking me, it fueled me. My father had given me nothing I wanted, but in his dismissal, he had given me fire. Years passed within those stone walls, marked not by birthdays or holidays, but by milestones only we understood. The first time I saluted as an officer in training. The first time I led a squad through a field exercise without faltering. The first time someone I respected looked me in the eye and said, "You belong here." Those moments stitched themselves into me piece by piece until I became someone my father would no longer recognize. And that was the point. I remember standing in formation at graduation, the sun beating down on a sea of white uniforms, the brass band playing as families cheered. Mothers waved flags, fathers snapped photos. The air was thick with pride and relief. I scanned the crowd, knowing what I would not find. My father was not there, he had not even called. My mother stood alone, her hat tilted against the glare, tears streaking her cheeks as I threw her a sharp salute. That image burned into me more than any photograph ever could. When the ceremony ended, I called home, just once, hoping maybe the silence would break. The phone rang until the line went dead. I sent a photo anyway, a snapshot of me with my commission papers in hand. Weeks later, I received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a clipping from a financial magazine about my brother's internship at Goldman Sachs. A yellow sticky note in my father's sharp handwriting said, "Only this is success." I tore it in half, but the wound lingered. Still, life in uniform did not allow much time for bitterness. Duty called me to places my father's money could never reach. I stood on decks where the ocean stretched endless and merciless. I walked through sandstorms that stripped the skin raw. I carried the weight of responsibility for people who trusted me not because of my last name, but because I had proved I would not abandon them. In those moments, far from marble halls and cocktail parties, I understood something my father never could. True power does not come from control or wealth. It comes from standing firm when the ground shakes beneath you. It comes from lifting someone else even when your own body screams to rest. It comes from belonging to something greater than yourself. Looking back, I see now that the real shadow of my wealthy family was not the money, not the empire, not even my father's scorn. It was the idea that worth could only be measured in profit and legacy. Breaking free of that shadow did not happen all at once. It happened in every bruise, every sleepless night, every scar that taught me the price of service. And though I did not know it then, those lessons would one day carry me back into his world, not as the obedient daughter he had tried to mold, but as the woman he had never expected me to become. That confrontation would come later, in a room full of people where truth could no longer be hidden. But the first battle was here, in chapter 1 of my story. The battle to claim my own life, the battle to step out from under the weight of his name and into the light of my own. And in that first victory, I found the beginning of everything that followed. The first morning in uniform felt like stepping into another life. Gone were the polished halls and hushed corridors of the Hallbrook estate. In their place stood concrete barracks, metal bunks lined with precision, and the sharp echo of boots against pavement. The world of oil and boardrooms had no power here. What mattered now was whether you could hold your ground when a voice roared at you from inches away and the weight of your pack dug into your shoulders until every step felt like carrying stone. I had thought I understood discipline. My father's house had its own rigid code, one enforced with cutting words and silent disapproval, but this was different. This discipline was not about appearances or reputation. It was about survival, about learning to move in unison with the person beside you, about discovering that your body could go further than your mind believed possible. The first weeks were a blur of shouting, sweat, and exhaustion. The sun rose before we did, and by the time it dipped below the horizon, every muscle in my body screamed. There was no space for vanity or pride. Hair pulled tight, boots blistered from endless marches, I became one of many. That anonymity was strangely freeing. No one cared that I was a Hallbrook. No one asked about oil profits or stock portfolios. They only cared if I pulled my weight, if I could be counted on when the line was breaking. There were moments I faltered. I remember one run in particular, my lungs burning like fire, the track stretching longer than it should. My vision blurred and I nearly stumbled. A hand steadied me, firm and sure. It belonged to Martinez, a wiry cadet from New Mexico with eyes that held both mischief and steel. He said nothing, just ran beside me until I found my rhythm again. That was the first time I understood the unspoken rule. Out there, you did not quit, and if you wanted to, someone would make sure you kept moving. Training stripped us bare. It revealed who broke under pressure and who held steady when chaos closed in. I found myself becoming sharper, stronger. The girl who once hid under library lights with books about soldiers was now one of them. I learned to fire a rifle until the weight felt like an extension of my body. I learned to navigate maps under starlight, to trust my instincts when the path was unclear. But more than that, I learned what it meant to be part of something greater than myself. Letters came sparingly. My mother's handwriting arrived like a fragile lifeline, each envelope smelling faintly of lavender. She told me about the roses in bloom, about how quiet the house felt without me, about her pride she dared not speak in front of my father. Those letters kept me warm on nights when the cold crept through the barracks walls. My father never wrote. His silence was its own kind of letter when I stopped waiting for. There were tests that went beyond drills and lectures. In one field exercise, we were dropped into a mock combat zone, given only coordinates and a compass. The night was moonless, the forest alive with shadows. Every snapped twig could have been an enemy. My team moved in silence, breaths controlled, eyes scanning. When a flare lit the sky and chaos broke, my instinct was to take charge. Orders tumbled from my mouth before I realized it. Cover left, hold position, move, and they listened, not because of my name, but because the command carried weight. For the first time, leadership felt like something earned, not inherited. Still, the cost of this world was steep. During one training mission, a fellow cadet collapsed from heat exhaustion. We carried him on our shoulders for miles until medics reached us. His face was pale, lips cracked, body limp. We thought we might lose him. That night, I sat awake, staring at the ceiling, realizing just how thin the line was between life and loss. He survived, but the lesson stayed. We were not invincible, and every victory came with risk. That truth hit harder later when training ended and real deployments began. We shipped out in waves, some to deserts that swallowed sound, some to seas that stretched endless and indifferent. My first assignment placed me in a unit tasked with reconnaissance and support. It was not glamorous work, not the kind of missions that filled history books, but it was necessary. And it carried dangers all the same. There was one day I cannot erase. We were traveling in convoy, the heat unbearable, sand clawing at our eyes. The blast came sudden, a thunderclap from the earth itself. The vehicle ahead erupted in fire and metal, the force knocking us to the ground. In that split second, training took over. We moved as one, pulling survivors from wreckage, securing the perimeter, calling for medevac. But the smoke carried with it more than debris. It carried names that would never answer roll call again. Among them was Davis, a soldier I had trained beside, a man who carried photos of his daughters in his pocket. I remember finding that photo in the dirt, edges singed, faces smiling up through ash. I tucked it into my vest, knowing I would send it home. That night, when silence fell heavy, I stared at the stars and wondered if my father would ever understand what that metal pin to my chest meant. Not vanity, not rebellion, but blood, sacrifice, and the weight of lives that did not return. When the purple heart was placed in my hands, I thought of my father's sneer, his dismissal of such honors as worthless metal. He would never know that behind each medal stood ghosts who deserved to be remembered. He would never know that I would carry their memory longer than I carried the medal itself. What surprised me most was not the pain or the danger, but the bond that formed in those shadows. We became family not through birth, but through fire. Martinez, with his quick jokes that kept us sane. Davis, whose absence we all felt like a missing limb, and others whose names etched themselves into my heart. In their presence, I found what I had never felt under my father's roof: belonging. I had entered the academy with defiance burning hot in my chest, desperate to prove him wrong. But somewhere along the way, the fire changed. It was no longer about him. It was about us, about every hand that pulled me to my feet, every shoulder that carried weight when mine faltered. It was about service, about finding strength in sacrifice. Looking back now, I see that those years in uniform did more than shape me. They saved me. They gave me a place to stand when the ground of my family life had always felt unstable. They gave me a voice when my father had tried to silence it. And they gave me a family that would never measure my worth in profit margins or cocktail invitations. The girl who walked away from marble halls had been searching for freedom. The woman who stood in combat boots under a desert sky found something deeper. She found home. There are nights that never leave you. Long after you hang up the uniform and pack away the boots, they come back uninvited, flickering in the quiet like old film reels. One of mine begins with laughter. We had just finished a supply run, the desert sun relentless, our throats dry as dust. Someone had managed to smuggle in a box of powdered drink mix from home. The kind kids stir into water until it glows neon red. Martinez cracked the box open with a grin. And for a moment the barracks smelled not of sweat and sand, but of childhood summers. We passed the cups down the line, our voices lifting in jokes, teasing, promises of what we would eat when we finally got home. The blast ended it. It came from nowhere, tearing through the night with a sound that split the air in two. The building shook, lights flickered, and for a heartbeat, silence hung heavy. Then the world erupted in screams and smoke. We scrambled. Instincts drilled into us, taking over. Get down, return fire, secure the perimeter. But beneath the commands was something harder to silence. The realization that not everyone had gotten up after that first explosion. When the smoke cleared, 3 of ours were gone. Their bunks still carried the imprint of their bodies. Their laughter still echoed against the cinder block walls, and yet the space where they had stood was empty. That was the night I understood what it meant to carry ghosts. Not the kind that haunt you in horror stories, but the kind that sit quietly at the edges of every memory, reminding you of what service really costs. I kept moving because that was what we had to do. We buried them with honors, flags folded into triangles, rifles fired into the sky. Families wept, officers saluted, and the world kept turning. But inside me, something shifted. I had thought I knew sacrifice. I had thought I understood service. That night, staring at 3 empty bunks, I realized I had only begun to learn. The missions did not stop. The desert had no mercy for grief. We woke before dawn, loaded into convoys, and pushed forward into landscapes that seemed endless. Heat pressed down like a hand determined to smother us. The wind carried fine sand that cut into skin, stung eyes, found its way into every fold of gear. Yet in that unforgiving place, bonds grew stronger. Martinez became more than a comrade. He became a brother. He was the one who noticed when my hands trembled after a firefight, pressing a canteen into them until the shaking stilled. He was the one who cracked jokes about home, about the green chili of New Mexico and the way his abuela would scold him for leaving his shoes at the door. His laughter carried us through nights that might otherwise have swallowed us whole. We clung to the small rituals, a letter read aloud from a spouse, a song hummed under the stars, a shared cigarette passed down the line. Those fragile threads kept us tethered to the world beyond the dust, and in those threads I felt something I had never known in my father's house. Family, not of blood but of choice. Still, loss never let us forget its presence. One afternoon on patrol, a vehicle struck an IED. The sound was deafening, a roar that seemed to tear the ground apart. We pulled survivors from twisted metal, our hands slick with blood and fuel. I remember cradling a young private, barely 20, his face pale, his voice a whisper. "Tell my mom I did good." His eyes closed before I could answer. I carry those words still, etched into me deeper than any scar. For each mission completed, for each safe return, there was always the shadow of what could have been. Medals were pinned to chests, citations read aloud, but behind every honor was the knowledge that someone else had paid the price. When I received the Bronze Star for leading a unit through an ambush, I thought not of glory, but of the faces of those who had not made it back. I wore that medal with pride, yes, but also with grief. Letters from home continued to arrive, though less frequently. My mother's handwriting grew shakier, her words shorter, as if she feared what might happen if she said too much. She told me she prayed for me every night. She told me she wished she could see me in uniform. Though she doubted my father would allow her to hang the photo on the mantle, my father remained silent, not a word, not a call, not even acknowledgement when my name appeared in a military newsletter. At first, his absence cut like a blade, then it became something else, a shield. His silence no longer defined me. My worth no longer hinged on whether he approved. The men and women beside me, the ones who trusted me with their lives, they were the measure now. And they never once doubted. There was a mission near the end of my deployment that still plays in my mind. Intelligence had placed us near a village where tensions simmered, where any wrong move could ignite violence. We moved carefully, eyes scanning, weapons steady. Children watched us from doorways, their faces curious and wary. An elder approached, his hands raised, speaking in a language I did not fully understand. For a moment, the world held its breath. Then one of our interpreters translated. "He is asking if you will keep them safe tonight." That request, spoken with such quiet desperation, pierced through me. I realized then that our presence was more than strategy or politics. For that village, for that family huddled in the dark, we were the thin line between fear and safety. And in that moment, I felt the full weight of what it meant to serve. When my tour ended and I finally boarded the plane home, I carried with me more than gear. I carried names, faces, laughter cut short, promises made under foreign skies. I carried medals that meant little to my father, but everything to those who understood. I carried the knowledge that family was not always bound by blood, but by the choice to stand beside one another when the world turned dangerous. Stepping onto American soil, the air felt different, softer, almost forgiving. Families rushed into arms, children squealed, spouses clung to one another as if they could make up for lost time in a single embrace. I stood apart for a moment, my duffel heavy at my feet, watching the reunions unfold. Then I spotted my mother, small in stature but fierce in her determination, waving with both hands. I ran to her, the years of silence and distance collapsing in that embrace. She whispered in my ear, "I am proud of you." Words my father had never spoken, words I realized I no longer needed from him, because in that moment I understood something vital. My father's house had given me nothing but shadows. The uniform had given me light, and though the battles ahead would not all be fought on foreign soil, though some of the hardest would take place in banquet halls and boardrooms, I had already learned the most important lesson. That strength is not found in wealth or control. It is found in the scars we carry, in the ghosts we honor, and in the family we build when the one we are born into fails us. When I signed my discharge papers, I thought I would feel nothing but relief. I had given more than a decade of my life to the uniform, carried scars on my skin and in my heart, and said goodbye to too many faces I would never see again. Yet as I walked away from the base that final morning, duffel over my shoulder, there was no celebration inside me. Only a quiet ache, the sense of closing a chapter I was not sure I was ready to end. The air smelled different back home, softer somehow, carrying the sweetness of cut grass and rain instead of dust and diesel. I drove through streets lined with familiar oaks and red brick houses, but the landscape felt foreign. I had lived so long in places where every sound was a warning that silence now seemed louder than gunfire. My neighbors waved, smiled, asked polite questions, but behind every glance I felt the distance. How could they know what it was to carry ghosts? I rented a small apartment near the edge of town, a place with creaky floors and sunlight that spilled through the blinds in the morning. I hung my uniform in the back of the closet, medals tucked into a box on the shelf. At night, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold, wondering if I had traded one kind of loneliness for another. The military had been my family, bound by trust and sacrifice. Civilian life felt weightless, unanchored. It was in that space of adjustment, still raw with loss and uncertainty, that the invitation arrived. A thick envelope with my father's seal embossed in gold. Inside, a card printed with perfect lettering announced his 60th birthday gala to be held at the Hallbrook estate. The words dripped with formality, a celebration of legacy and philanthropy, proceeds to benefit the Hallbrook Foundation for veterans and families. I stared at the card for a long time, fingers tightening until the edges bent. My father, who had dismissed my service as worthless, now draped himself in the mantle of charity for veterans. The irony cut sharper than any blade. I should have thrown the card away. I should have refused. But something inside me, call it defiance or unfinished business, whispered that I needed to see him again. The night of the gala, I drove past the gates that had once felt like prison bars. The mansion glowed with light, windows blazing. Music drifting out into the cool night. Valets in crisp uniforms guided cars along the drive. Guests in gowns and tuxedos stepped onto red carpets rolled across marble steps. For a moment, I sat in my car, hands clenched on the wheel, fighting the urge to turn around. But I had faced fire and loss. I would not run from this. Inside, the house looked the same as it had when I was a girl, yet everything felt different. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above polished floors, servers moved like shadows with trays of champagne, and laughter echoed through vaulted ceilings. But beneath the glitter, I felt the old chill return, the coldness of a house that valued image over truth. I moved through the crowd, nodding politely at strangers who spoke of stock prices and mergers, their words falling like a language from another world. I caught sight of my brothers, taller now, sharper in their suits, each surrounded by clusters of business allies. They glanced at me, eyes flicking with recognition, but offered no more than a nod. We had become strangers long ago. What struck me most were the uniforms among the tuxedos. Veterans stood scattered through the room, some in dress blues, others in suits with pins on their lapels. Their presence startled me at first. It felt out of place, as though two worlds that rarely touched had collided inside these marble walls. Then I remembered, this was not only a birthday party. It was a fundraiser, my father's stage for generosity. I overheard conversations near the bar. Stories of scholarships awarded to the children of service members, housing stipends for wounded veterans, grants for families rebuilding after loss. Faces lit with gratitude, voices carrying genuine relief. For them, this foundation meant real help, and for a moment I felt torn. I could not deny that lives were being changed. Yet I also knew the man behind it, a man who saw charity as another form of profit, a shield to polish his name. Then I felt it, the eyes of my father across the room. He stood near the grand staircase, flanked by senators and CEOs, his glass raised in conversation. Time had etched lines into his face, but the sharpness remained, the aura of control unbroken. When our gazes met, he gave no smile, no nod, only a flicker of recognition before turning back to his guests. It was as if I were another obligation he had no interest in fulfilling. My mother found me near the gallery of portraits. She looked smaller than I remembered, shoulders stooped, hair streaked with silver, yet her eyes warmed the chill. She touched my arm lightly, her smile trembling. "I am glad you came." Her voice cracked, and I realized how much she had carried in silence all these years. We spoke only briefly, her glances darting toward my father as if afraid he would see her linger too long. Still, she whispered, "I have kept every letter, every clipping. I am proud of you," and for a moment the house felt less cold. As the evening stretched on, the tension thickened. The music swelled, speeches were promised. And I knew it was only a matter of time before my father claimed the stage. Around me, glasses clinked, laughter rose, but beneath it all was the hum of expectation, the sense that something unsaid was waiting to break free. I felt out of place in my simple dress, surrounded by jewels and tailored suits. Yet when one of the veterans approached, his posture stiff but his smile genuine, I felt the weight shift. He clasped my hand, eyes flicking to the ribbon on my lapel. "You served, didn't you?" I nodded, his grip tight and steady and sure. "Welcome home." Those two words held more power than any speech I had ever heard. And in that moment, standing among strangers and ghosts, I knew why I had come, not for my father, not even for myself, but for the truth that could not be polished away by chandeliers and champagne. The night was only beginning, but already the past and present had collided inside me. The woman who had walked away from this house years ago stood now in its heart, no longer the obedient daughter, no longer the silent soldier. The tension hung thick, waiting for the moment it would shatter, and I knew it would. The clinking of glasses drew the room to attention. My father had mounted the small stage set beneath the grand staircase, his glass of champagne raised high. Conversations hushed, servers paused mid-step, and every eye turned toward him. The glow of chandeliers bathed his silver hair, giving him an almost regal presence. He thrived under this light, under the weight of expectation. His voice carrying as easily as it had when he was a younger man announcing acquisitions and victories in boardrooms. Friends, colleagues, partners, he began, his tone polished smooth by decades of speeches. Tonight we celebrate not just another year of life, but the legacy we build together. He gestured toward the banners of the Hallbrook Foundation draped along the walls. This foundation stands as proof that success carries responsibility, that those of us blessed with abundance must return it in kind. Applause rippled across the room, measured and polite. He smiled, savoring it, then motioned toward the veterans and their families scattered among the guests. Tonight we are honored by the presence of men and women who have worn the uniform of this great nation. Through our efforts, we will provide scholarships for their children, homes for those in need, and dignity for those who sacrificed. More applause, louder now. Genuine from some, perfunctory from others. My father knew how to command a crowd, how to cloak ambition in benevolence. He paused just long enough for the sound to swell, then lowered his glass, his eyes sweeping the room until for the briefest second they landed on me. It was then that his tone shifted, the polished cadence softening into something sharper. Of course, he said, there are many ways one can serve this country. Some build companies that fuel economies, that create jobs, that shape futures for generations. Others choose different paths. His words hung, deliberate, his gaze brushing past me as though I were only a shadow in the corner. And while we respect all choices, we must not confuse symbolic gestures with true leadership. The words struck with surgical precision. Symbolic gestures, a phrase meant to slice cleanly through the years I had spent in uniform, through the blood and sacrifice I carried in my heart, around me. The crowd shifted uneasily, some nodding, some looking away. My throat tightened, but I forced myself to remain still. He went on, oblivious to the sting he had delivered. Medals and ribbons may shine, he said, his lips curving into a smile that was not quite kind, but true influence is measured in what we build, in the institutions that endure. This house, this company, this foundation, these are the monuments that last. A silence fell, heavier than the crystal chandeliers. My chest burned with words unspoken, the urge to rise, to challenge him, to tell the truth of what those medals represented. But I remembered the promise I had made to myself years ago. I would not let him draw me into his game of control. My father thrived on dominance, on forcing others to prove themselves under his terms. I had spent too long in deserts and battlefields to surrender to that stage, and yet the sting of humiliation was real. I felt it in the pit of my stomach, in the ache that spread across my shoulders. I glanced toward the veterans near the back of the room. Men and women who had carried weight like mine. Their expressions were tight, jaws clenched, eyes narrowed. They had heard the insult too. The applause came again, weaker this time, scattered. My father raised his glass once more, closing with a toast to legacy, to service, to the future. The crowd dutifully echoed his words, crystal clinking, smiles practiced. Then the music resumed, chatter swelling back to life as though nothing had been said. But something had shifted. The room felt colder. The laughter more strained. I moved toward the edge of the crowd, my chest still tight, when a hand touched my arm. It was one of the veterans, a man older than me, his suit simple but his bearing unmistakably military. His eyes locked on mine, steady, unflinching. I heard what he said, he murmured, and he is wrong. His voice carried the weight of someone who had buried friends, who had worn medals not for show but for survival. You and I both know those pieces of metal mean more than his empire ever will. The words broke something inside me, not in pain but in release. Validation, truth spoken aloud by someone who understood. He squeezed my arm once, then melted back into the crowd, leaving me with a steadiness I had not expected. My mother approached soon after, her face pale, her hands twisting in front of her. I am sorry, she whispered. as if she were to blame for the venom in my father's words. "You should not have come. He cannot help himself." But her apology only deepened the ache, because I realized she had spent her life excusing him, covering his cruelty with silence. I wanted to tell her I was stronger now, that his words could not undo the years I had fought to build myself. But I could not. The wound was too fresh, the room too crowded. Instead, I kissed her cheek and told her I would be fine. The rest of the evening blurred. Laughter rose in pockets, toasts were made, music swelled, but the undercurrent of tension never loosened. I drifted through conversations, barely hearing the words, my thoughts circling the speech, the insult. The years of silence that had led to this moment. And yet, beneath the ache, something else stirred. Resolve. I realized that the confrontation I had dreaded was no longer avoidable. My father had drawn the line as publicly as possible, dismissing my life's service in front of the very people he claimed to honor. The time would come when truth would have to be spoken, not for my sake alone, but for every veteran in that room who had felt the sting of his dismissal. When I stepped outside into the cool night air, the music muffled behind closed doors, I tilted my head back to the sky. Stars spread endless above me, the same stars I had stared at in deserts halfway across the world. They looked no different here, above marble walls and manicured lawns. They reminded me of who I was, of the family I had chosen in the field, of the sacrifices that would never fade. I straightened my shoulders, the night air filling my lungs. Whatever came next, I would not face it alone. And as I turned back toward the glowing house, I knew the story was not finished. The stage was set, the truth was waiting, and soon it would break free. The music slowed as the master of ceremonies tapped his glass again, drawing the hall back into silence. It was time for the final round of speeches, the kind my father lived for. He stepped back onto the stage with the easy confidence of a man who had never been denied an audience. The spotlight pooled at his feet, bright against the polished floor, and the banners of the Hallbrook Foundation swayed gently above him. He spread his arms as if gathering every guest into his embrace. "Tonight," he began, "we celebrate more than my birthday. We celebrate the power of vision, of discipline, of leadership that transforms fortune into impact." His voice swelled with practiced rhythm, and heads nodded dutifully across the room. He painted a picture of scholarships for the children of service members, of housing programs for struggling veterans, of partnerships with hospitals and schools. Every line was crafted to polish his image as a benevolent patriarch, the man who turned oil into opportunity. I might have believed him too, had I not known the cost of every check his foundation wrote. They were not gifts but investments, each one calculated to maximize prestige, minimize taxes, and amplify his reputation as a titan with a generous heart. Then his tone shifted, subtle at first, a dip into something sharper. "There are, of course, many ways one might define service," he said, his eyes roaming the hall. "Some build companies that fuel progress, creating jobs for thousands, shaping markets, directing the currents of the future. And then there are those who mistake scars and bits of metal for lasting legacy." The words cut like a blade honed for years, my breath caught as though I had been struck. Around me the hall stiffened, murmurs faltering into silence. My father did not say my name. He did not need to. His gaze slid toward me, glancing off my shoulders heavy with medals that were anything but decorative. He continued, his smile practiced, his cadence smooth. "True greatness is not found in uniforms. It is found in the boardroom, in the marketplace, in the empire one leaves behind." A hush fell so complete I could hear the faint hum of the chandeliers. I kept my chin lifted, my back straight, refusing to shrink. Yet inside, anger boiled. Not for myself alone, but for every man and woman in that room who carried scars far deeper than mine. For a heartbeat the silence held, brittle as glass. Then a chair scraped loudly against the floor. An older man, dressed in a simple dark suit, rose from his table near the back. His shoulders were squared with military bearing, his hair close-cropped, streaked with gray. His voice, when it came, was steady and low, but it carried across the room with the unmistakable timbre of command. "You call those medals useless, Mr. Hallbrook?" The question hung, sharp and unflinching. My father blinked, caught off guard. The man stepped forward, each word precise. "I wear the same kind of medal. Bronze star, purple heart. I buried friends who never came home. friends who would give anything to hold that ribbon on their chest even once. The room froze, every eye swinging between the stage and the man below. His voice did not rise, but it thickened with grief. That piece of metal you mocked represents blood on the sand. It represents nights when we prayed our brothers would survive until dawn. It represents sacrifice your oil wells and boardrooms will never understand. A ripple moved through the crowd. Veterans scattered across the tables shifted in their seats, jaws tight, eyes blazing. A woman with a service dog placed her hand on the table and stood too, her gaze locked on my father. I would trade every dollar in this room, she said quietly but firmly, for one more chance to see my husband alive. He died for that metal you dismiss. My chest ached as if I could feel the weight of their words pressing against my skin. I had expected silence, maybe sympathetic glances, but not this chorus of truth rising one by one. My father's face paled, his composure cracking at the edges. He tried to laugh, the sound brittle. Of course, I respect sacrifice. That is why this foundation exists, but the metals themselves, symbolic, are they not? The first man's eyes narrowed. Symbols matter. Nations rise and fall on symbols. Flags, oaths, medals. You think your name on a skyscraper means more than blood on the ground? You are wrong. The applause began hesitantly, scattered at first, then louder, swelling like a tide. Not polite claps, but the raw, insistent rhythm of solidarity. Civilians joined too, led by instinct more than understanding. Heads turned toward me, not with pity, but with recognition. I remained seated, my back unyielding. My hands still in my lap. This was not my fight to wage. It was theirs, and they had taken it up with the ferocity only truth could summon. Beside me, I felt the light touch of my husband's hand resting on my shoulder. He did not grip or shield, did not step into the spotlight as a savior. He simply anchored me, his presence a reminder that I was not alone in this hall, nor in this life. The weight of that quiet support steadied my breath. My father stammered, his words faltering now. We must remember that business too requires sacrifice. The hours, the risks, but the room was no longer with him. Veterans rose to their feet, one after another, some saluting. Others simply standing tall in silence. Their presence drowned his words, turned them to ash before they left his mouth. Even the donors and executives shifted uneasily, sensing the tide had turned, unwilling to be seen applauding arrogance. The moment stretched, heavy and undeniable. The empire he had built on commanding attention cracked beneath the weight of truth he could not control. His hand trembled around the stem of his glass. For the first time in my life, I saw him small. Finally, with no applause to rescue him, no power left to wield, my father cleared his throat and muttered something about thanking everyone for their generosity. Then he stepped down from the stage, his shoulders stiff, his eyes refusing to meet mine. The judgment followed him, not shouted but present in every stare, in the silence that swallowed his retreat. I sat unmoving, metals glinting under the chandelier, my head held high. Around me, men and women who knew the cost of sacrifice stood as one, and in that unity I felt something stronger than anger, stronger even than vindication. I felt belonging. The truth had risen, and it could not be buried again. For a long moment the hall remained frozen in silence. The only sound was the faint hum of the chandeliers and the uneven breathing of men and women who had stood their ground. My father had retreated to his seat at the head table, his complexion pale beneath the warm glow of the lights. He raised his glass again as though to cover the tremor in his hand, but no one followed. The applause had ended. The spell he once commanded so easily was broken. The band attempted to rescue the mood, sliding into a gentle jazz number, but the notes felt hollow, a soundtrack for a room that no longer belonged to him. Conversations sparked back to life, hushed at first, then louder, but the undercurrent had shifted. The authority that had once bent every ear toward his voice had drained away, replaced by something heavier, unspoken, but undeniable. I remained seated, my husband's hand steady on my shoulder. My metals catching the light like small stars. I felt their weight not as a burden, but as armor, forged from memory and loss, from nights in the desert and dawns I thought would never come. For years my father had dismissed them as trinkets, symbols he believed could not measure against his towers of glass and steel. But tonight those pieces of metal had silenced him, not because of me, but because of those who had lived their meaning. The veteran who had spoken returned to his seat. His expression was calm, his shoulders relaxed, as if he had done nothing extraordinary. But in that moment, he had altered the balance of power in the room. My father had been confronted not by his daughter, whom he could dismiss, but by his peers, men and women he had paraded as ornaments of his generosity. They had claimed the truth aloud, and no amount of money could erase it. I caught my mother's gaze across the table. Her lips trembled, and her eyes shimmered with something like apology, but also pride. She had spent a lifetime covering for him, softening his edges, apologizing for wounds that were never hers to carry. Tonight she said nothing. Her silence felt different, like the opening of a door that had long been locked. The donors and executives shifted in their seats, whispering to one another. They had not come for confrontation, but they understood the current of public opinion better than most. A few clapped politely in my father's direction, the empty gesture of those unwilling to risk offense, but even that died quickly. His authority had slipped through his fingers like sand. I breathed slowly, deliberately, allowing the silence inside me to expand. I could have stood, spoken, defended myself with words sharpened over years of contempt, but I did not. This was not about my voice, not tonight. This was about the voices of those who had bled beside me, who had carried the flag into places my father could never imagine. They had spoken, and their truth was louder than anything I could add. Beside me, my husband leaned close, his whisper barely audible. "You do not need to fight him. You have already won." The warmth of his words sank into me like a steady flame. The evening limped forward. Speeches concluded half-heartedly. The band played on. Waiters circulated with trays of champagne that few accepted. Conversations bent toward the confrontation, retold in quick whispers. "Did you hear what he said? Can you believe it?" The story already slipping from his control, spreading like cracks across marble. When dessert was served, my father excused himself from the table. He did not storm out or make a scene. That would have given others a story of defiance. Instead, he rose quietly, shoulders hunched, and slipped through the side doors with only a few noticing. But those who did saw the truth. His retreat was not dignity, it was defeat. I sat for a long time after, sipping water. Watching the room, the veterans gathered together in small knots, their faces relaxed now, relief mingled with satisfaction. They had defended more than me. They had defended themselves, their brothers and sisters, the memory of those who had never come home. One of them approached me, a woman with lines etched deep across her face and a voice husky from years of smoke and shouting. "You didn't have to say a word," she told me. "We saw you. We stood for you." Her hand brushed my shoulder. Light but grounding. For the first time in years, I felt what I had once felt in the desert, in the barracks, in the field. Belonging. Later, when the evening finally ended, guests filtered out into the night air, the mansion's glow spilling across the driveway. I lingered near the doorway, my husband at my side as the veterans passed by. Some nodded, some saluted, some simply met my eyes with a look that said everything words could not. Each exchange stitched a thread into something stronger than the legacy my father had tried to claim. When the last guest had gone, I walked alone into the library, away from the echo of clinking glasses and false applause. The room smelled of leather and old cigars, lined with shelves of books that had served more as decoration than substance. I sank into one of the chairs, the weight of the evening pressing down but not crushing. I thought of my father as a younger man, striding through this house with the same confidence he had carried tonight. I thought of the little girl I had been, hiding in corners, desperate for approval that never came. I thought of the soldier I had become, shaped not by his expectations but in defiance of them. Tonight had not erased the years of pain or neglect, but it had drawn a line between past and present. He had tried to humiliate me. Instead, he had revealed himself. When my husband joined me, he said nothing at first, only poured a glass of water and set it beside me. His silence was a gift. Space to breathe, to let the storm inside me settle. After a while, he said quietly, "You carried yourself with more honor than he has ever known." I closed my eyes, letting the words sink in. Honor. It was not a word I often claimed for myself, but tonight it felt right, not because of the medals, not even because of the service, but because I had chosen silence when pride demanded fire, because I had trusted the truth to speak louder than anger. The house was quiet now, shadows stretching long across the walls. Somewhere down the corridor, I heard the faint sound of my father's footsteps retreating to his study, alone. I wondered what he thought in that solitude, whether he recognized the collapse of the authority he had wielded for decades, or whether he clung stubbornly to the illusion that money and power could repair what had broken. I realized it did not matter. His reckoning was not mine to carry. I rose, straightened my shoulders, and walked out of the library, the sound of my boots steady on the polished floor. Each step felt lighter, as if the weight I had carried for years had finally begun to lift. Outside, the night air was cool and clear, the stars brilliant against the dark. I tilted my head back, breathing deeply, letting the sky remind me of nights overseas when I had felt both small and infinite. I had survived those nights. I had survived this one. And tomorrow I would rise again. Not as his daughter, not as the shadow of his empire, but as myself. A soldier, a woman. A survivor who no longer needed his approval to know her worth. The mansion was quiet when I woke the next morning. The storm of the night before had left its residue in the air, a heaviness that clung to the walls. Servants moved softly, as though careful not to stir the house awake. My husband had risen early, his side of the bed still warm when I touched it. For a few moments I lay still, staring at the ceiling I had known since childhood, and tried to reconcile the girl who once counted the cracks in its plaster with the woman who had stood silent beneath chandeliers while strangers defended her honor. On the nightstand sat an envelope, thick, cream-colored, bearing my name in my father's handwriting. The sight of it made my chest tighten. I had not seen that script on paper in years. He had spoken his judgments aloud often enough, but letters were rare, reserved for negotiations and condolences that required more than words spoken into a phone. I broke the seal with steady hands, though my pulse quickened. The note inside was brief, no more than a handful of sentences written in that sharp, deliberate style of his. "Perhaps I was wrong," it read. "Perhaps I do not understand the kind of service you chose. I do not know another way to live but the one I have built." There was no apology, not truly. Just an admission of confusion or maybe exhaustion. The words carried neither warmth nor cruelty. They were flat, stripped of the grandeur he wrapped around his speeches. For a man who had prided himself on certainty, it was the closest thing to humility I had ever seen. I folded the letter and set it back on the nightstand. My emotions tangled in ways I could not easily name. Relief that he had acknowledged even a sliver of doubt. Sadness that it had taken humiliation to force him to write it. And a deep, unshakable resolve that I would not let his words decide the course of my life any longer. After breakfast, my mother found me in the garden, where roses clung stubbornly to their blooms despite the creeping chill of autumn. She sat beside me on the bench, her hands clasped in her lap. "He has not stopped pacing," she murmured, her voice heavy. "He does not know how to face you." I did not answer. What could I say? That I had waited a lifetime for him to face me, and when he finally had, it had been to wound me in front of a crowd. That his letter felt less like a bridge and more like a man tossing stones into water, hoping one might land in reach. My mother touched my hand, her fingers cool and delicate. "I want you to know," she said, "that I am proud of you. I always was, even when I did not say it." Her words cut deeper than my father's ever had because they came with the ache of lost years. I leaned into her shoulder, allowing myself to rest in that fragile space of tenderness, even if it had come late. That evening we left the mansion. I did not say goodbye to my father. I left the letter behind on the nightstand, unopened again, as if to remind him that words alone were not enough. My husband drove us back into the city, the lights of the skyscrapers reflecting on the windshield like distant constellations. In the weeks that followed, I found myself drawn not to the circles of wealth and influence my family had occupied, but to the small gatherings of veterans in church basements and community halls. There were women who had served in silence, women whose stories were tucked away behind modest smiles and jobs that barely paid the rent. They welcomed me not as the daughter of a wealthy man, not as someone who had been decorated with medals, but as one of their own. One evening I listened as a young Marine, barely older than I had been when I enlisted, spoke about her struggle to transition back to civilian life. Her voice trembled, but her honesty filled the room with a kind of courage more profound than any uniform. When she finished, the room erupted in applause, not the polite rhythm of galas, but the raw thunder of solidarity. I felt something stir inside me, a recognition that this was where my voice belonged. I began to speak too, cautiously at first, then with growing strength. I told pieces of my story. Not the battles my father had dismissed, but the nights I lay awake missing friends who would never come home, the mornings I rose to put one foot in front of the other when grief felt like an anchor. I spoke of what it meant to carry medals not as ornaments but as memorials, each one a reminder of the lives intertwined with mine. The more I shared, the more I listened. I listened to women who had lost spouses, to men who carried scars visible and invisible, to children who grew up with folded flags where parents should have stood. And in that listening, I discovered something my father's empire had never given me: community, family, a place where no one measured worth in wealth, but in resilience, in truth, in the willingness to stand for one another. The Hallbrook name meant little here. My medals mattered, but not for their shine. What mattered was the willingness to lay them down on the table, alongside the stories of others, as proof that we had endured and that endurance was a kind of victory. It was in one of those meetings, in a modest hall with flickering fluorescent lights, that I realized the path ahead of me. I would not spend my life chasing the shadow of my father's approval, nor would I waste it resenting him. I would tell these stories. I would carry them beyond the walls of basements and into places where the world could not ignore them. If he used his wealth to build monuments of steel and glass, then I would build monuments of memory, carved in words and carried in hearts. That choice felt simple and impossibly profound all at once. For the first time, I understood that freedom was not just the absence of chains. It was the ability to choose where to place your love, your energy, your voice. And I knew exactly where mine belonged. Winter came early that year. By late November, the city was cloaked in gray, the streets slick with rain that glittered like silver under the street lamps. I spent more time in church basements and small community halls, telling and listening, weaving my story into the fabric of others until I could no longer tell where mine ended and theirs began. Each gathering left me both emptied and filled, as if the act of pouring out grief made space for resilience to take root. One night after I had spoken at a gathering for female veterans, a young woman approached me. Her uniform was long gone, replaced by civilian clothes that looked too large for her thin frame. Her eyes carried the hollow look of someone who had seen too much too young. She whispered that she had thought about ending her life more than once, but that hearing me speak had reminded her that she was not alone. She pressed my hands in hers and said, "Thank you for not letting silence win." Her words stayed with me as I walked home in the rain, each drop against my skin a reminder that the world outside went on, uncaring, while inside those halls lives were quietly saved. My father would never understand that kind of legacy, but I did, and it mattered more than any skyscraper bearing his name. Weeks passed. Then on Christmas Eve, another envelope arrived in my mailbox, my father's handwriting again. Though shakier this time, the note was longer than before, but the words still rang hollow. He wrote of tradition, of expectations, of the ways he had tried to shape me into something that fit the Hallbrook mold. He wrote that perhaps he had failed me or perhaps I had failed him. In the end, he said, he wished me peace. I folded the letter without finishing it. I felt no anger, only a kind of sorrow that we had never learned to meet in the middle. He had chosen his monuments. And I had chosen mine. Perhaps that was the truest peace we would ever share. New Year's came and went. Life settled into rhythm. I taught workshops for veterans, spoke at schools about resilience, met with families who had lost loved ones. Each story deepened my conviction that my purpose was not to correct the legacy of my father, but to build one of my own. A legacy of truth, of voices carried forward. It was during one of those quiet evenings at home, after the world outside had gone still, that I opened the wooden box on my dresser. Inside lay my medals, nestled against velvet, their ribbons still bright though years had passed. I lifted them one by one, feeling their weight in my hand. They were not decorations, they were reminders, each one tied to a face, a voice, a moment of laughter before silence claimed it. Beside the box sat a photograph, worn at the edges from years of being carried in my pack. It showed 4 of us, arms slung around each other, dust in our hair, exhaustion in our eyes. But grins wide and reckless. 2 of those faces were gone now, buried far from home. The third was alive, but lost in battles no one else could see. I placed the medals gently beside the frame, arranging them so the ribbons brushed against the smiling faces. My throat tightened, and for a moment I could not breathe. Then I whispered into the quiet, "These are my true family, the ones who never turned their backs." The words were not rehearsed, they came like breath, simple and unshakable, and in speaking them I felt a weight lift that I had carried for years. Family had always been defined for me by bloodlines, by wealth, by a last name that opened doors. But in that moment, I understood with clarity that family was chosen. Family was the ones who stood beside you in the heat, who held your secrets, who remembered your laughter after you were gone. Family was not always the people who raised you. Sometimes it was the people who saved you. The house was quiet around me, my husband asleep down the hall. I stayed at the dresser for a long time, tracing the edges of the photograph, letting the memories flood and settle. I thought of the veteran who had spoken out at my father's gala, of the woman who had told me I had saved her life, of the children who would grow up with stories instead of silence. They too were part of this family, bound not by blood but by truth. Outside the window, the city lights blinked against the dark, steady and unyielding. I knew my father still lived in his world of towers and boardrooms, still chasing the illusion that power was measured in balance sheets. Perhaps he would never see beyond it, but I no longer needed him to. My worth was not his to define. In the weeks that followed, I traveled more, speaking in towns I had never visited, sitting in circles of folding chairs where strangers became sisters and brothers. Each time I told my story, I felt the thread of connection grow stronger. And each time I returned home to that photograph and those medals, grounding myself in the reminder of what truly mattered. Years from now, when I am gone, my medals may gather dust, my name may fade, but the stories I told will remain, carried forward by those who found strength in them. That is the legacy I chose, and in the end, it is enough. When I look back on that night, what stays with me is not my father's words, sharp as they were, but the way the room shifted when others stood. I had carried my service like a quiet weight, never asking for recognition, never demanding respect. Yet in that moment, I saw how truth has a way of finding its voice, even when you remain silent. It was the veterans who rose, the widows, the soldiers with scars both visible and hidden. They spoke not only for me, but for all of us who have known sacrifice. I used to believe family was something you were born into, that bloodlines and legacies decided your place in the world, but my years in uniform taught me otherwise. Family is not just a last name etched into marble. It is the brother who covers your flank in the dark. It is the sister who shares her rations when you are too tired to stand. It is the one who sends you a letter from home, reminding you that you are not forgotten. That night I understood that the truest family is the one that never turns its back when the world does. The medals I carry will never glitter like the glass towers my father built. They will not outlast empires or hold the weight of billions, but they carry something more enduring. They carry memory. They carry courage. They carry the names of those who gave everything. And when I place them beside the photograph of my fallen friends, I know that no speech, no insult, no dismissal can take away their meaning. I share this story not to ask for sympathy or for praise. I share it because I know many of you carry your own scars, your own burdens, your own memories of battles fought in silence. Maybe yours were fought overseas. Maybe they were fought in your own homes against voices that told you you were less than what you knew you could be. I want you to know this. You are not alone. Your story matters. And your strength, even when you feel unseen, can inspire others to rise. My father chose to build his monuments in stone and steel. I choose to build mine in memory and in truth. And if these words reach even one person who feels like giving up, then that is legacy enough for me. Thank you for walking with me through this journey. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to like the video and subscribe. Not just to support me, but to help these voices travel farther. Share in the comments where you are listening from, and if you feel moved, share who you carry in your heart. Together we can honor them. Together we can remind the world that courage and love outlast everything. Because in the end, it is not wealth or power that defines us. It is the family we choose, the stories we carry, and the quiet strength to keep standing when silence would be easier. That is the truth I claim. That is the truth I leave with you tonight.